Hey everyone, my name is Untitled Chapter. Have you ever wondered what your camera is thinking when you take a picture with a traditional camera and not your smartphone? Today I'm going to break it down into the three elements that make up taking a picture, called the exposure triangle, which consists of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. To get right into it, shutter speed controls the amount of motion blur in your picture. If you have a fast shutter speed, so something like 1/200th, 1/500th, or 1/1000th of a second, the shutter is going to open and close really fast, and it's going to freeze the action in the frame. There's not going to be a lot of motion blur. This is good for things like sports or animals, people running around, moving fast, and also minimizing the amount of camera shake that shows up in your picture if your hands are, kind of wiggling everywhere. On the opposite end, a long shutter speed, so something like 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds even, will leave the shutter open for more time, which is going to let more light onto the sensor, and will also increase the amount of motion blur if you are not locked off on a tripod. If you want to control just the shutter speed on your camera and let the camera do everything else, set your camera to the shutter priority mode, which is represented on Nikon and Sony systems with an S, and on Canon systems it's marked with a TV on the mode dial. After shutter speed is aperture, and the aperture controls two things, the depth of field and the amount of light that is entering the camera, and they go hand in hand. Inside of the lens there's an opening that's called the aperture, and that opens or closes to let more or less light into through the lens and onto the sensor. A small aperture doesn't let very much light through to the camera because the hole in the aperture is very small, and this is recognized, and you can notice it by numbers like f7, f8, f11, f16. It does not let very much light through. On the other hand, numbers that are seemingly small have large apertures, so things like 2.8, f2, f1.4. These are going to let more light into the camera, and it's also going to affect your depth of field. The depth of field refers to the amount of a picture that is in focus. If you're shooting with a large aperture, so something like 2.8 to 1.4, you're going to have a very small part of the picture in focus. This is good for things like portraits, or where you want to isolate your subject, or if you just want to let more light into the camera because it's dark, or it's dark. On the other end, for things like landscapes, certain kinds of portraits, architecture, those are things where you're going to want what's called a narrow depth of field, which is where most of the picture is in focus. And so it doesn't really matter what you focus on, something is going to be in focus, but don't let that deter you from missing your focus. If you want to adjust just the aperture and let the camera do everything else, you're going to want to turn the camera to AV for the Canons and then A for Nikon or Sony systems. To round it off, you have the ISO, which controls how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Right now, this camera is shooting at 400 ISO, which it looks pretty good. If I bump this up to 800, just like that, none of the other settings change, but you can see how much brighter it is. The lower the number of the ISO, the less sensitive your camera is going to be to light, and you'll need more of it to get the proper exposure. If you have a higher ISO, something like 1600, 3200, 6400, you're not going to need as much light to get the proper picture. But when you increase the ISO, you're going to introduce more digital noise and grain into your picture. If that's something that you're picky about, this is what that kind of noise or grain can look like. And it's just kind of preference for you. There are softwares that can minimize this, especially in post-processing with Lightroom or Photoshop, but it's just kind of your preference. Just be aware that as your ISO increases, the more noise or grain you're going to see in your picture. So there you have it. There are the three elements to taking a proper picture with a traditional camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We want to see your pictures that you take through the quarantine with your digital camera, not your cell phone. So go ahead and post those to Instagram, tag us with the hashtag Lehi Legacy Live photo. On May 1st, we will release a video with some constructive criticism, compliments, what we liked, what we didn't like, things like that. We'll have that for you guys and for your viewing pleasure come May 1st. That is next Friday. Mark your calendars, and can't wait to see what you guys produce.
Welcome to Tips and Tricks 101 with Braxton Paz. I'm Gunnar Paz. This is Carson Lancaster, and Braxton Paz will not be present. Today we're going to be showing you some tips and tricks on what to do when you are bored. Once again, this is Tips and Tricks 101 with Braxton Paz. I'm Gunnar Paz, this is Carson, and Braxton is not involved at all. Seriously, he's not involved. So tip number one, when you're bored, is tip number one is trash a car. Tips and Tricks 101!
Tip number 2, play video games.
Yay! We're playing good old Beat Saber for playing video games. Tips and Tricks 101. The VR goggles are fogging up because I'm talking and I can barely see, and it's getting really fast. I'm playing on expert mode and
You look like such an idiot.
thanks! Where's the camera at?
Right there.
Oh man. Tip number 3, go for a walk in the woods. Ooh!
Tip number 5, because we don't have a number 4.
That's right, we skipped it. Silly boy.
Exactly.
We're so silly.
Is watch TV.
It's a good one. It's a good one. It's a good one.
Wow, this is so entertaining.
That's tip number, I forgot the number. Catch you on a flippy flip. Yeah, this is so stupid. And for tip number 4, that's right. We went from number 5 to number 4. We tricked you. We have a number 4.
Pull the sneaky.
We have go for a drive. That's right. Coming in at number 4, go for a drive. We're going for a drive at number 4. Catch you on the flippity flip. We're gonna cut to scenes of number 4 with the drive. This is boring actually. Don't do this tip. This tip is dumb. Don't go for a drive. Just That's all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us at Tips and Tricks 101 with Braxton Paz, but it's just me and Carson. Braxton is not here. He's not here. He's not in Tips and Tricks 101. He did a video a couple years ago, and it was just him, but he's not involved in this at all. It's just me and Carson once again. Just to me and Carson, Tips and Tricks.